Look, we all know Pan's Labyrinth is absolutely one of the richest, most beautifully layered films on the A-level Spanish syllabus. But let's be totally honest here. It's also kind of one of the hardest to teach, right? There is just so much going on. Well, in this quick explainer, I'm going to show you how to teach it clearly, confidently, and in a structured way that actually helps your students grasp those massive complexities and write those top-band essays.
Because Guillermo del Toro gives us this literally perfect blend of a dark, twisted fairy tale mixed with harsh political reality. The symbolism is incredibly rich, the characters are these sharply drawn archetypes, and the historical context of post-Civil War Spain, it's absolutely essential, but thankfully it's very manageable to teach. It's the kind of film that truly rewards that close, critical analysis that examiners are always looking for.
So, okay, let's dive into this ready-made lesson plan. We'll be looking at the two worlds, the key themes, character arcs, symbolism, some historical context, and finally, a few revision resources.
Starting off with Section 1, the two worlds, reality versus fantasy.
The most crucial concept to introduce to your students right off the bat is the idea of these two parallel worlds. On one side, you've got the brutal, fascist reality of 1944 Spain, commanded by the completely ruthless Captain Vidal. And on the other, the magical but still really dangerous fairy tale world that our protagonist, Ophelia, escapes into. But here is the absolutely critical point your students must understand. The fantasy world isn't just an escape. It's not a distraction. It's actually a vigilant commentary on the real-world history of Franco's regime. The tasks Ophelia performs in the fairy tale, they parallel the real-world struggles of the anti-fascist resistance. Once students grasp that these worlds reflect and inform each other, literally everything else clicks into place.
Moving right along to Section 2, Key Themes and the 5 Essential Focus Areas.
There are 5 essential themes you need to teach here. Think of them as thematic buckets for your students' essays. Number 1, obedience versus disobedience. This is the absolute moral heart of the film. Del Toro is showing us that blind obedience is dangerous. I mean, Ophelia's ultimate triumph only comes when she actively disobeys the faun to protect her innocent baby brother. Second is innocence versus brutality, perfectly embodied by the contrast between Ophelia and Vidal. Third is resistance, which we see in Mercedes, the Maquis rebels, and all those small acts of defiance. Fourth, fantasy is truth. This is about how the magical world actually reveals deep emotional and moral realities. And fifth, power and patriarchy, with Vidal standing as the ultimate, chilling embodiment of authoritarian control. If your students can connect specific scenes to these 5 themes, their essays will become so much more analytical.
Okay, let's look at Section 3, character arcs or treating people as symbols.
Here is exactly how I like to break down the key players. First, we have Ophelia. She's the innocent seeker representing imagination and moral courage, choosing disobedience, but for the right reasons. Then there's Captain Vidal. Listen, he isn't just a generic bad guy. He is fascism personified. He's all about order, control, violence, and this desperate need for a clean Spain. Now, compare him to Mercedes, our quiet rebel. She represents emotional strength and really acts as the film's moral backbone, fighting this covert resistance right under Vidal's nose. We also have Carmen, Ophelia's mother, who represents fragility, survival, and honestly, the tragic cost of submission. And of course, we can't forget the Faun, who acts as this really ambiguous guide, constantly testing Ophelia's morality. Getting your students to view these characters not just as people, but as walking symbols of broader historical and moral forces, that's the key to hitting those higher marking bands.
Which brings us to Section 4, symbolism and visual style.
Del Toro is a total master at communicating massive ideas through his mise-en-scène. Just look at the terrifying pale man sitting there hoarding this massive feast at the head of a long table. This is a brilliant visual mirror of Captain Vidal, who also sits at the head of a huge table, hoarding rations and controlling the food supply during the brutal post-war years of hunger. It's a perfect parallel. Del Toro is using visual cues like this to show us that the monsters in the fantasy world, yeah, they're direct reflections of the real-world monstrosity of the fascist regime.
There are a few other essential symbols you'll want to cover too. The labyrinth itself represents choice, destiny, and moral testing. Then there's the motif of the key. And notice how symbols cross the two worlds here. Ophelia retrieves a magic key from a giant toad, which perfectly parallels Mercedes using a secret warehouse key to sneak rations to the Maquis rebels. Both keys represent access, secrets, and resistance. Next up is the mandrake root, highlighting the clash between magical healing and rational cruelty. And finally, the doll's pocket watch. This one's huge. It represents his absolute obsession with legacy, strict order, and inherited violence. Definitely tell your students to always link these symbols back to the themes we discussed earlier.
Let's move to Section 5, Essential Historical Context.
Now, remember, context should explain character behavior, not overwhelm your students with a giant history lecture. But to understand the stakes of the film, they do need to grasp the harsh reality of Spain in 1944. Following the Civil War, the regime implemented severe, brutal repression. Up to 200,000 people died of starvation during the early years of the dictatorship, a period literally known as the Years of Hunger. Sharing a stark statistic like this with your class grounds the film's fantasy elements in a very grim, very real historical struggle for survival.
So what are the absolute essentials you need to cover? First, post-Civil War repression, the idea that the victors actively persecuted the defeated. Second, Francoist ideology, which was totally driven by hypermasculinity and militarism. Third, the harsh reality of rural poverty. Fourth, the incredibly strict role of women under fascism, basically confining them to motherhood and total obedience. And lastly, the rebels acting as symbols of hope, fighting this desperate resistance out in the mountains. The crucial takeaway here is that understanding this ideology and those strict gender roles completely explains both Captain Vidal's immense cruelty and Carmen's tragic submission. It makes the characters' actions actually make sense to the viewer.
And finally, Section 6, Revision Resources.
If you want a ready-made tool to help your students visualize all of this without starting from scratch, I highly recommend grabbing the full Pan's Labyrinth resource pack linked below. It includes ready-made sketch notes, worksheets, and revision activities. It's pretty much everything you need to teach the film with confidence and save yourself hours of planning while giving your students a clear, overarching view of the film's complexities.
Teaching this film is such an incredible journey. By structuring your lessons around these two worlds, the key themes, the archetypes, and targeted historical context, you're really equipping your students to analyze the film with real depth and confidence. So as you sit down to prepare your next lesson plan, ask yourself, how will you help your students unlock the labyrinth? Good luck and have a ton of fun teaching this absolute masterpiece.